First of all, I'd like to say welcome everyone. I'm Sylvia Howes and I've got some of my awesome Data for Good team members behind the scenes, Samantha and Kiani. They're helping me manage the webinar today. So just the housekeeping, we'll be presenting this in webinar format, which means we can't see your videos and you're muted. But if you've got any questions, just type them in the Q&A box. We'll be looking at those after the webinar. So just type them in as we go along and I'll be putting them to the speakers afterwards. So as you know, last week we celebrated Reconciliation Week. But even as we commended our country's guardians, they're again living through the anguish they've been through so many times. So we'd like to express solidarity with our Indigenous friends now and going forward. So as we acknowledge the traditional owners throughout Australia, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, we pay our respects to their elders. We pay our respects to the elders past, whose understanding of the ecosystems nursed country. We pay our respects to their present elders, who continue to pass on knowledge and provide guidance that we can all learn from. And we pay our respects to emerging community elders. We hope they continue to find means through which their voices are heard and registered. And during Reconciliation Week and always, we show our commitment to look after the environment, this country and its people. So we've also got some people joining from New Zealand. So we'd like to acknowledge the Maori people of New Zealand and say kia ora to our friends joining us from NZ today. On the 10th of August, we'll be having a special webinar to celebrate World Indigenous Peoples Day. So we'll send you an invitation to that separately. And we'll look at how data can be used to support our Indigenous people. Today, though, is World Environment Day. So first up, I'm going to welcome Jason Carr, who's the Australasian Hydrogeology and Digital Water Lead for the engineering and architectural firm Arup, where he actively brings his passion for restorative and regenerative engineering practices. Both environmental planning and architectural design involve long-term thinking, and they can be supported by accessing the right data. So to share how data can be used in those long-term visions, I'll hand you over now to Jason Carr.
Hi everybody. So I suppose you want me to share that screen?
Yes.
Here we go. Try and get that nice and big. Is that coming through?
Yep, I can see your screen, Chase.
All right, cool. See if that works. All right, all good. So hi everybody. Yep, as I guess Sylvia's already done that introduction, so thanks very much for that. I don't need to waste too much time on that. So my primary role at Arup is working as the Hydrogeology and Digital Water Lead. So hydrogeology is the study of groundwater, and digital water is really how we can exploit data to create enhanced and actionable insight and improved decision-making across the water sector, which I think will interest everybody today because we're all into data and that's why we're here. So I also work closely with our foresight and innovation and our Arup Ventures teams as well, where these departments specialize in identifying major trends that shape the future of the built environment and commercial opportunities that shape a better world. So given this is Data for Good presentation on World Environment Day, I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of my experiences navigating 2019 and 2020, which have been extremely tumultuous from a corporate planning perspective. In particular, I wanted to share with you some of the insights we've had on how to lead a green recovery in a post-COVID-19 world, as well as all the other disasters we've gone through recently. I wanted to elaborate on how corporations and individuals can set a long-term vision and measure their impact on the United Nations sustainability goals as well. So every year, World Environment Day is celebrated on the 5th of June to raise awareness about the importance of maintaining and defending Mother Nature and the entire planet from further harm and destruction that stems from natural disasters caused by men, it's led by the United Nations. And interestingly, the United Nations has labeled 2020 as a critical year for biodiversity and the climate emergency and nature-based solutions. The UN are calling it a super year for the environment, setting the tone for a decade to come. There's the face masks we're all used to. So it's really interesting that we are the first generation to have enough data to understand the the impact that we're actually having on our planet. It gives us unique opportunity to act. For myself and other practitioners working in the built environment, we need to better understand our planet, how it functions and operates in its interconnected living systems. We need to work collaboratively across disciplines, including scalability, feasibility, how to design, build, and construct in ways that promote positive planetary impacts. Even more importantly is how we come up with our strategies to have a maximum impact as well. So I just wanted to spend a bit of time evaluating where some of these problem areas are regionally and more globally. So as a hydrogeologist, I've worked on stacks of environmental impact statements for major projects all over Australia, globally on global design infrastructure projects. And as an environmental engineer, it's really frustrating for me. It frustrates me to no end how we're always trying to make sure that there are minimal impacts on the environment, or if we have impacts, we are offsetting the impacts somewhere else. We do this because we're always trying to find a balance between the social, environment, and economic outcomes for individual projects. And so in the case of the urban built environment, it's really hard to keep a straight face as an environmental specialist when you are designing another massive road or rail project, airport, underground tunnel to try and find ways to benefit the environment when the premise is you are just trashing it. These projects involve literally moving mountains, altering water courses, injecting cement and grout into everything. I looked up a quick statistic that in 2019 alone, the world produced 4.1 billion metric tons of concrete, or 4 trillion kilograms. I did a pretty quick calculation last night, and please feel free to fact check me. But Sydney Harbour holds about 500 gigalitres of water, or 500 billion litres of water. That is enough concrete to fill Sydney Harbour 8 times over. So, and by its very nature, concrete resists nature. Its chief quality is to harden and then degrade extremely slowly. It's the foundation of modern development, putting roofs over the heads of billions, fortifying our defenses against nature, and providing structure for healthcare, education, transport, energy, and industry. So our blue-green world is becoming grayer by the second. By one calculation, we may have passed the point where concrete actually outweighs the combined carbon mass of every tree, bush, and shrub on the planet. Our built environment in these terms is outgrowing the natural one. So concrete is likely the most destructive material on Earth, and we use it every single day. So I've just spent the last 4 minutes telling you why I'm probably the last person who should be lecturing anybody about environmental protection, given I largely work on teams that design these structures every single day. But the hard truth is that we're really all in this together, because the majority of homes are made up of this material, and concrete, quite frankly, lubricates the economy and makes our lives so incredibly safe and efficient. In fact, our government boasts every day about the importance of infrastructure and our unprecedented $93 billion infrastructure budget in New South Wales. $55 billion of that is going towards road and rail projects alone. It's quite literally where over half of our tax dollars in New South Wales are going. We are now in a recession, and what do we need? We need jobs. What's the best way to get dollars moving through the economy? Build infrastructure, build houses, go, 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 because the only thing more important than your health and recovering from COVID-19 is getting back to building more infrastructure. And we're going to stimulate the economy. We're going to move out west. We're going to build high rises, more metro lines, more roads, more airports, and so we can really call Parramatta the center of Sydney. Good. So we're all completely addicted, aren't we? We're completely addicted to concrete. We should probably get, some dirty tobacco adverts on cigarette boxes. Maybe we need some pictures on the state budget with people choking from all the dust in North Sydney and Western Sydney, or maybe some people sweating on their couches in Western Sydney from the urban heat island effect. Because, when that part of the city heats up because of a lack of water bodies and removal of vegetation and urban heat island effect, because there's some great material properties about concrete, you probably know that it absorbs and it retains heat. A great material, for the country, which frequently makes the headlines for being the hottest place on Earth. And it's any wonder why the Australian climate has experienced longer, hotter, drier fire seasons and more severe weather events. Concrete, given these urban heat island effects as well. I'll be really interested to see what the findings of the Royal Commission are on the latest fire season. So the other thing about concrete is it's about 8% of the world's carbon. It's responsible for about 8% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. And if the cement industry were a country, it would be the third largest emitter behind the US. So thinking more about Australia's environmental impact globally, I think I've just set the scene of where there's some massive environmental effects happening regionally. I just want to put into context the impact we're having sort of, I guess, overseas. So globally, today China is Australia's largest trading partner, both in terms of imports and exports. The steel and coal industry have a massive impact on atmospheric carbon. The reason we're so critical as a trading partner to China is because infrastructure plays a critical role in raising people's living standards. And China is in the business of raising up an entire new middle class. China wants to double their middle class from 300 million to 600 million in the next 5 years. That is basically raising up the population of America to the middle class. In fact, in response to COVID-19, China has just thrown another $500 billion in response to COVID-19, much of which will go towards new infrastructure, as well as an additional $600 billion to build more airports, railways, and power grids. That's over $1 trillion that's just been committed in May. That's a lot of infrastructure. And China currently imports about 60% of its iron ore from Australia, and we provide about 50% of China's coking coal, which is used in steelmaking. China being the largest steel producer in the world, as well as its largest exporter. China is also the world's largest CO2 emitter. 10% of the total carbon footprint in China arising from steel and the cement industries. Australia is also the biggest thermal coal supplier to China, providing feed to China's coal power plants, providing 35% of China's thermal coal imports. China accounts for nearly 30% of the world's global carbon dioxide emissions. That's far off the 0.3% we state that Australia is accountable for. Given that thermal coal makes up 60 to 70% of China's energy generating capacity, the rest is mostly made up of hydropower. And in that sense alone, I mean, Australia could be held accountable for producing 10% of the world's carbon emissions if you would just do that calculation. So don't even get me started on the Belt and Road Initiative with all that concrete. Now, I'm not saying all of this to have a massive dig at China, because that's really easier and it's like a favorite pastime of Australians. I'm saying all this to identify where there are opportunities to make a real difference and where to focus our efforts. And for all the people on this call, I just want to do a few quick stats on data centers. Data centers themselves are really energy intensive. The sector accounts for 2% of global emissions at the moment, which is actually equivalent to the aviation industry. And this is expected to grow to 3.5% by 2021. And if that's any indication of how quickly that sector is scaling. So whilst we're all moving to Microsoft Teams and Zoom and having more and more video calls, there is an environmental impact associated with the way that we work. So it's like, don't travel because of planes, but then we're all spending more time on the computers, but they're actually equivalent in terms of emissions. So, it's not like China doesn't recognize this problem either. I mean, in fact, by 2030, their plan is to have 1/5 of the total energy generation shifted to non-fossil fuel sources. They're now leading the market expansion in renewable energy. And my recent experience of working in parts of Asia has shown that there's a real trend to moving towards improving environmental outcomes that are tied to the UN SDGs, which is a really interesting shift I've noticed in the last year, even in tenders that are coming out and looking at what's coming out of the Asian Development Bank. It's estimated that, in fact, from the Asian Development Bank, it's estimated that $26 trillion of infrastructure investment is required between 2016 and 2030, or $1.7 trillion a year, to maintain its growth and momentum to eradicate poverty and respond to climate change to impact substantially on the UN SDGs. This largely includes transport, power, telecommunications, water supply, and sanitation projects. So herein lies the greatest opportunity of our generation, is to do things differently, to find a better way. And I guess speaking more to our strategy now, by 2030, we want to have meaningful, and this comes from our board, is to have meaningfully and demonstrably contributed to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. as defined by the UN SDGs, and secured the future of our firm by being recognized as a leading consultant and critical partner in the quest for a safe and inclusive, resilient future for all. That's their words. So critical and central to our work is moving our current designs. So there's our corporate strategy and statement. So we actually want to move our conventional designs from conventional to green to sustainable to restorative to regenerative. So where our conventional designs had this massive ecological loss associated with them, which everybody can see with urban design, urban sprawl, to projects that are actually increasing ecological gain, which I'm really proud of, as well, because I've just, the last 10 years in my work, it's just project after project is minimizing impacts. To actually think about moving to improving ecological impacts is just a huge shift in mindset, which is actually really, really great. So a big part of where we're heading is having a vision of where we're going. So Arup's come up with a bit of a thought piece on what would society look like in 2050. So depending on how hard we push these SDG outcomes, the future includes a world where where the world experiences or improvements or declines in planetary health or societal conditions. Labeling these futures Extinction Express, Humans Incorporated, Greenwashing, and Post-Anthropocene. And I'd really encourage you to go and have a read of this, actually. It's basically this 2050 futures. The Post-Anthropocene shows how societal conditions and planetary health might exist in a harmonious relationship, fortifying each other for mutual progress and benefit. In the Greenwashing, there is an improvement in planetary health, which has been enabled by severe restrictions on human society and restrictive living conditions, conflict in authoritarian regimes. In Humans Incorporated, it represents our current trajectory in a world which societal conditions and the advance at the cost of our planetary health. The final condition being the Extinction Express, which depicts both declining planetary health and societal conditions. Here it's questionable of how much longer humanity can really survive. And these four worlds are all plausible and impart a valuable message, but there's no future state, just as there's no one present state. So here in the post-Anthropocene, we can see a world boasting balanced biosphere, balanced biosphere, and spaceship Earth and humanity are thriving in harmony. And I would say that a lot of these futures are kind of based off media inspiration as well. So in this example, in the post-Anthropocene, there's pieces like Metropolis, Soylent Green, Food Inc., 2081, and A Brave New World. And you can see that all the SDGs are making great progress in this world. In the Greenwashing, which kind of looks good on the surface, you have all these green buildings and everything. So we see how it's almost like the SDGs have been forced and biosphere improvements have been made. So the ecosystems are on a clearly charted recovery plan, but the societal conditions have maybe taken the fall. In Humans Incorporated, we've made a half-hearted effort in the environmental stewardship and only gradual societal improvements. Probably reminiscent of what some of the scenes we're seeing around the world today. And here in Extinction Express, by the mid-20th century, it's marked by extensive degradation of planetary and human conditions. So some of these pieces include like Interstellar, Mad Max, Code 46, Wall-E, Idiocracy. So there's some great books and media pieces that represent that. So what do corporations do? How do we prioritize? How can we make a difference or plan out these futures? So we use these scenarios to help prioritize our research, our development, and guide our clients towards a more sustainable future. So for Arup this year, we're heavily investing in net zero decarbonization, city resilience, circular economy. And at the heart of how we deliver these themes with our client is short-term and long-term value. Because, everything we actually build today is not really built to last. As a designer, you'll know that even the stations we build, they might be built to last 50 years or 100 years, and they're designed to meet a certain maybe storm event. They kind of plan in climate change, but nothing is built to last. Everything needs to be replaced, which is why it's so important with concrete thinking about how we're actually going to build this life cycle into the circular economy. So I've outlined some really clear opportunities for a post-COVID-19 opportunities for a green recovery in Sydney. So we know Sydney is expanding west. We're going to be building, are we going to build grey or are we going to build blue-green? Please go and look at Sydney's green and blue grids. The Greater Sydney Commission has elaborated that this in our plan that they want to be going blue-green, and they've actually identified spatial areas. So I think for many of us on the call, looking at ways we can identify and partner with the government on these opportunities, because they do want it, and no one stakeholder can pull it off alone. There actually needs to be a lot of partnerships to pull off some of these plans. Waterways and air quality, these are two factors that have really impacted us recently with the fires, dust storms, constant construction dust. Not only does this affect us, it really affects our environment as well. So there's some really great opportunities. Resilience, I've put up a number of thought pieces that Arup has actually completed on resilience, so please go and have a look at that. And Arup's partnered with in a collaboration called the Resilience Shift, which I think should go and have a look at that as well. So there's some great data and some great thought pieces in there too. So as data scientists and engineers, we're well placed to create new operating models to add values to our clients. So please go and look at like what sponge cities look like in Asia, and cities that are capable of retaining water and support ecosystems and actually capture carbon. And looking at this, what the UN is calling these, these natural, they're kind of like, it's basically like naturalistic designs, I would say, where rather than a road rather than concrete holding structures in place, you're actually looking at maybe trees to hold roads in place, or rather than trying to resist the incoming tide with a seawall, actually looking at wetlands which capture carbon, but also you're setting aside space for nature where you can increase biodiversity but naturally attenuate disasters. I think the last one sort of locally is biodiversity. And I think that the next presentation by TERN will help us how we can actually measure and accelerate increases in biodiversity that aren't just token efforts. I mean, we see a lot of buildings that are going up with green on them, and that's great, but are they actually drastically increasing the biodiversity in the local area? So more globally and Australia-wide, it's clear that the world needs more infrastructure, but infrastructure doesn't need to be conventional. It needs to serve multiple benefits. Think about where you and your company can have impact. So you may not like that China is spending massively on infrastructure and they're rolling that out across the world, but also think of this spending as an opportunity to improve processes. We know where the greatest polluting areas are. There's plenty of maps of where the greatest pollution areas are, say in China or America. So if we know where these areas are and we have the data to support that, go and get your hands dirty and think about how you can improve the situation with alternative regenerative designs. And lastly, rather than reacting to each crisis that comes up and trying to be the center of media attention, think about where you're best placed to impact on the SDGs. It's not necessarily your responsibility to track the progress of the SDGs. And I think a lot of companies kind of make this mistake. The UN and other foundations are doing a really, really good job of that. And they're funded to do that as well. So focus on partnering with initiatives like the Resilience Shift and be very specific about which SDGs you want to impact, and track indicators that are relevant to your company locally and the clients that you're working with specifically. So whilst it's great to say we impact 100 million people globally, people now want to know, how did you impact them? Did you impact them positively? Did you impact them negatively? What's the local story? And specifically, which SDG did you impact on? So I hope all of that has been helpful. That's the end of my presentation.
Cool. Thank you so much, Jason. Can people see me and hear me? Thank you, Jason. Those stats are pretty scary. So, but clearly some serious actions need to be taken, and you need those sorts of statistics and the data backing it to show that it is serious and that we need to take action ASAP. And I hesitate to say this, but sounds like some pretty concrete steps need to be taken.
Awesome.
So keep sending your questions through, everyone. Jason will be hanging around to answer some questions afterwards. Next up, though, we welcome Dr. Beryl Morris, who's the Director of the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, which observes and measures ecosystem change from site to continental scale over decades to centuries. While they have over 700 ecosystems observing sites and more than 2,500 open data sheets, we won't have time to look at them all today, but Beryl will share with us where data can measure environmental impact. Welcome, Beryl.
Thanks, Sylvia. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to give you a glimpse of what's involved in running a national research infrastructure. I'm sure many of you are familiar with things like the Australia Telescope, but probably not TERN, which is equivalent type of infrastructure working on behalf of Australia to record things about our environment. So we have got several partners in TERN, and the University of Queensland, the James Cook University, CSIRO, University of Adelaide, and behind them there are actually dozens and dozens of other research institutions that work across the country recording information about the environment. The really interesting thing about running national research infrastructure, which is looking at land ecosystems, is that all of the exciting science that we're going to hear about in about 30 years' time is actually the product of the infrastructure that we're putting in place today. And you can see on our map that we've got recording points scattered right across the country. It's commensurate with the amount of funding that we get from our national grant from the Australian government, from the NCRIS program. But we are in combination with other groups that are also recording and measuring the environment. We have good coverage, and we're in the key ecosystems in the country. There's a national need for something like TERN because there are a lot of questions that scientists are asking about the environment, and these are all related to how the environment is changing, what direction it's changing, and how resilient the environment is to the change. So, for instance, with the seeming increased rate of bushfires that are occurring in Australia, we're very interested in the idea of looking at evidence of whether, in fact, the biological system can recover quickly enough before the next cycle of bushfires go through. In this picture, you can see that we work on multiple scales, and we have instruments that are able to take a picture right across the whole continent, such as our satellites, speeds, drones, aeroplanes. We also have people that go out into the field and work across regional scales, looking at how the environment's changing. And then we have some deep dive sites that are looking at why the change that's being picked up by the regional and continental level monitoring is happening. The type of things that we've got pictured in this diagram, you can see that it's very heavily reliant on people being in the field doing lots of measuring and recording. We are measuring micrometeorological data 24/7, 365 days a year, taking the pulse of the environment. And of course, we're taking the feed, as I mentioned, from satellites in the environment. The types of data that we have relate to the sorts of equipment that we've deployed across Australia. So we have what is called gridded data, which is the continental scale remote sensing soil and terrain data products out there. We have plot-based data, which is really what comes from the individuals that go into the field and survey vegetation and soil on a regular basis, building our time series data. And they also help with the calibration and validation of data that comes in from remote sensing, remembering that when a satellite goes over, it delivers pixels, and we have to make sure that there is some correlation between the pixels and what is actually on the ground, particularly since satellites are limited by by cloud covers and canopy cover, the people that are in the field are very important. And lastly, we have time series data, which comes from mainly from our sensors, and the types of sensors that we've got are very large towers that reach up into the sky above the vegetation that they're located in, although not all vegetation is tall. We do have some very short towers, but we have towers up to 80 metres, taking a lot of information about carbon and water and temperature and things like that. We have PhenoCAD, which are looking at vegetation change, recording things like when things are flowering and budding and so on. And we've got acoustic monitoring from sensors, so there's a very wide sensor network out there. In addition to all of the infrastructure that is hardware, we have a very strong reliance on social infrastructure. It's actually more important than the physical infrastructure to have networks of people and reliance on people who are actually in locations that we don't get to very often because we're just in our offices and so on. And a really good example comes from work that's being done in the Tanami Desert, which is in Northern Territory. There's an area that's 1.3 times larger than the area of Tasmania, 10 million hectares, that we don't have any sensors in, and we're totally reliant upon the people that live in that area. And so we have Indigenous rangers and traditional owners who use a combination of animal tracking and bird surveys and small vertebrate tracking. They carry out vegetation transects following training from the project partners that are involved in the project. And they've delivered biodiversity data from a very remote area that is otherwise difficult and expensive to get to. And that information is available through TERN's data infrastructure so that we can assess the changes over the space of that area and the time changes. So we're able to see the impact of invasive species, for instance, and the changes to some of the threatened species that after mining impact on the region's flora and fauna. TERN is all about long-term data. We work in the ideas of measuring locations for a century or so, not a few years. We've only been going for 10 years, so obviously our data is very slender at the moment, although we have been able to pull into our databases collections that were set up by other groups, and in some cases we've got data up to 90 years of continuity. The sorts of things that you can do once you start looking at long-term data is understand the rate of change. And in the picture that you're looking at the moment is an annual scorecard that's brought out using TERN data and data from all sorts of other sources to look at the condition of our environment. And the condition of the environment is a complex thing to measure. It's made up of many, many different factors. And so in this case, it's an example from the 2015-16 year where it's trying to show how much change that had happened from the previous year. That's made up of tree cover and soil exposure and leaf area and river inflow, carbon uptake, etc. And in that year, there was relatively good environmental conditions. The report card that's come out on 2019 was not very good. And if anyone's interested, they can follow that through from TERN's website. But there are many pluses from having environmental infrastructure such as that run by TERN, spillover effects that one doesn't even think about. So there's technology innovation. We're facing quite a challenge in Australia of putting out sensors and so on. They are easily sort of wiped out by cyclone and floods and hail and bushfire and things like that. And we're forever trying to work out how to do things smarter, how to use new Earth observation technology to support us. And so in this example, we talk about the wireless sensor network that we have underway in Australia, which is comprised of a whole lot of remote camera traps that can pick up things like the cassowary that's shown in the photo, operating alongside time-lapse vegetation cameras to record all of the cycle of flowering and leaf drop and budding and so on, and acoustic monitoring. It's really exciting to see how much development there has been in ecoacoustic monitoring. In the past, we've gone out and laboriously trapped mammals and released them and things like that, but now we are able to take sound recordings in an area and measure the changes over time in the diversity of things recorded in the signal, and we're starting to be able to align parts of the signal with specific animals as well, so that we can test invasive impacts on biodiversity or just drop off completely of certain key species. And so we do, with technology development, build complete pictures with our wireless network. We're also able to use the technology to increase collaboration across Australia amongst researchers and open up the data that's held by governments and industry by bringing them, aggregating them into the data portals that we have. This is really important because such data is otherwise not accessible to us, but by being able to take, for example, Queensland government vegetation plot data and bringing it together into TERN's data portal with our vegetation data, we give the researchers ability to use data that's really significant in length of time that it's been collected, and without people having to go and reinvest in collecting, and so they can get on to the task of working out the answers to the questions about how much is the environment changing and so on. We're also surprisingly able to add a lot of benefit to the health of Australians through TERN's infrastructure. Who would have thought it? But a group of very innovative people got together and worked out that if they used our remote sensing data on when there's vegetation flowering, they could, and how the air is moving across Australia, they could forecast when there would be high allergen loads in certain areas. And now that's actually led to a national pollen monitoring network that provides valuable information for the health sector. We're able to forecast dust storms by analysis of our data to predict future occurrences. It was pretty obvious mid last year by analysing all of the material that we had on drought and various other parameters that 2019-20 was going to be a very bad year for bushfires, just looking at biomass and things like that. We're also able to look at past data to be able to help governments think about how to predict cyclones in an area. And all of these are very important for health. There are educational improvements that we can point to. School students, you've probably all been there, go on a field trip, collect your data, it goes back into the classroom and that's it. But hey, if you can harness every school child that goes into the field, data that they've collected and bring it together into something such as TERN's data portal, then the students of Australia are already getting familiar with the ideas of big data. They're getting used to the idea of citizen science and how much impact they can have. And the next group of students that go to the location are able to build on their predecessing students' efforts in the field to be able to answer more meaningful questions than, you know, how many shells there are on the beach. And so we build portals for students to be able to put those items of data into. We're also able to use data to increase Australia's international impact. We have a very high standing internationally from quality of research that we have. And with quality research infrastructure, obviously we are able to do world-leading research. And the research infrastructure is also very important for diplomacy. If you're collaborating internationally, then you're building relationships. And so, for instance, we've been working with a worldwide group to do observations about drought across the world as a global impact. And our sites in Australia are also invaluable around the world as a way of calibrating some of the Earth observation satellites. The International Space Station is running quite a few research experiments at the moment, and they're heavily reliant on the quality that Australia has invested in research infrastructure to be able to calibrate what they're seeing from the space station. And talking of global research infrastructure, it's pretty obvious that, as you'd all imagine, that Australia is actually at the mercy of a whole lot of events that are happening on a global basis. And so TERN, because we have a continental level scale observatory in Australia of our ecosystem, we're able to join with other groups around the world that have similar initiatives. So there's a European one, a US one, a South African, and a Chinese one that line up against what we have in Australia. And that means that we can have a look at all of the interactive effects of some of the things that are happening internationally. The importance of all of this is that if we just stayed working as individual countries, national sovereignty would mean that we would govern our own territory and we wouldn't look beyond our boundaries at things like global warming, acid rain, marine pollution, which don't recognise national borders. But by all of those national research infrastructures joining together into the global ecosystem research infrastructure, and I should say that TERN was the group that led this off with a think tank back in 2016 at the first World Science Festival that was held in Brisbane, and it brought everyone together for a first stab at this, and it's developed very well since. But we're able to share ecosystem data, or we will. We're still working on how to get it interoperable and comparable. But if we do that, then we get the global understanding of the environment, and we start to be able to properly give evidence-based data to some of the global agreements, such as the Sendai Framework and the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 report on the state of the environment, the Paris Agreement for carbon, by bringing together very easily and simply through research infrastructure initiatives what can't be achieved by government. There are multiple ways that you can get into TERN's data, and I think that the easiest thing is just to start at TERN's webpage and have a little explore at what we've got to offer. Today was only ever meant to be a taste test to let you know that we exist and that we are mandated to keep monitoring everything that's happening in the environment, which is a fabulous thing to be doing on World Environment Day. And I think it's
cool. Thanks so much for that, Beryl. It's great to see that there's so much data being collected, and so much data that other people can access as well, so people can start to do their own investigation into what they can do with that data and how they can collaborate and combine data sources to get some real insights out of that. So thank you for that. We are running a bit behind time, but that's okay. I hope you, Beryl and Jason, still can hang around for a couple of minutes to answer a few questions that have come through. So Jason,
sure.
Can we see you too? Is Jason visible? I will just click a few buttons and, okay, so Jason's visible. Okay, so the first question is that there's first of all, from Kelsey, she says, thanks for the great presentations. And she thinks there's a big risk to environmental progress around greenwashing of initiatives. And how do we best navigate this to find the real environmental value behind projects? So I'll start with you, Jason, and also continuing with that, how do you communicate that to consumers and stakeholders?
Yeah, there's a massive risk of that, and I think it's really helpful the work that TERN has done, and as well as environmental agencies and all the space organizations, and actually making a lot of the information available free at a very low cost. So in terms of greenwashing, it's really easy to get confused. And I guess I'll give an example that there's plenty of viewpoints and biases which are pushed in the community. Back in the day, I used to work doing environmental reports for a mine site, a long time ago, where you're trying to make sure the mine is not or having minimal impact on the environmental communities. And we would actually go and do hard science, and we'd do a lot of work to actually really understand what's happening in the environment, and you're there to do it independently. And there were a lot of examples where activists would actually take pictures of impacts that would happen off-site or weren't actually related to specific events. And I guess in many ways that could be construed as kind of that greenwashing, is that this site is having a massive impact, and the whole CSG industry went under. I'm not saying because of greenwashing, like there were legitimate concerns, but I knew a lot of the people operating the rigs out on the field who were going above and beyond to collect as many parameters as they could, make the information live and available so that people could make decisions. But sometimes it's those community concerns that aren't actually being addressed or not being addressed adequately or early enough. So being upfront really early, having data to support you, and actually involving groups as stakeholders and give them a voice early on. We're starting to see some models where even blockchain technology is beginning to be rolled out, looking at this decentralized approach to projects and oil projects overseas, where people are getting a voice earlier into the piece to make sure that the concerns are being raised, and everything's being made available from both sides of the argument rather than just constantly each side attacking each other. So data is really central, but it needs to be early on. It needs to be independent. It needs to be reviewed in third party. So it's very costly, but it's critical to this debate.
And it needs to be in the right context. And I think, Beryl, that's probably where a lot of your data helps out. So did you want to expand further on that, Beryl?
Yes, so there's a big move at the moment to really make transparent environmental impact assessments so that data that is collected during the assessment process is digitally available to all of the regulators and the proponents. And TERN is working on a project that is trying to deliver new skills into that process so that there's trusted modelling of what might happen over the period of a development and post-development. There are many places in, it's okay to say about greenwashing, but what if the thing goes ahead and the impacts turn up many, many years later after people have gone out of business, moved on, retired, things like that. So the need for long-term data monitoring and the need to forecast what might be happening as other things change around it, like climate change, urbanisation, etc., all impact, and it's a dynamic system. So just because you do an assessment at one point doesn't mean that you don't need to continuously revisit that and reassess your assumptions along the way. And so we hope to bring that into the research infrastructure arena in a very short period of time so that we can get trusted forecasts for everyone to look at and open up the whole question of greenwashing.
Yeah. And Jason, another question that came through specifically for you is, what is the best source for learning more about the green and blue grids? But maybe Beryl can touch on that too. But Jason, we'll start with you.
Yeah, look, I've actually posted some links into the chat. Literally, if you type in blue-green grid into Google, you will come up with the Greater Western Sydney Commission and the Government Department for Architecture and Planning, whatever it is. And they have done extensive maps across Sydney where they see opportunities for connecting up infrastructure and connecting up initiatives. And they've overlapped different layers, spatial layers. So that's for Sydney. And for Melbourne, they've done a very similar thing. I haven't seen a grid so much, but more as their overarching design and philosophy and approach the buildings moving forward. So that's the example, I guess, where most of the users are going to be from. So I think it's just green. I think it's a green planning more from, green infrastructure, greening the city, Melbourne. So I've got those links in there.
Yeah, cool. Beryl, did you want to add to that? Or I've also, a question that came through was about how similar, so we've got a lot of data around Australia, and we're also looking at data sources from overseas, is where is the most common overlaps? Like what areas can we really say, if this happens in Australia, then we can expect to see the same sort of data coming through from overseas?
That's really interesting. Australia is quite unique. It's not, so we actually have to carry out a lot of our own repeat work in Australia because we can't take the data from the Northern Hemisphere. It doesn't apply in Australia. But interestingly, the Northern Hemisphere is looking to Australia to understand things like, because we're hotter and we have droughts and so on, and so we have huge numbers of hits in some of our drought affected recording sites from the Northern Hemisphere, as they try to model what might be happening there. So, but TERN belongs to a number of international networks, such as with carbon flux. We belong to the International FluxNet group, and that pulls the data from across the world. Australia is very uniquely placed in the Southern Hemisphere. We've got South Africa and we've got Australia, but there's nothing really reliable, and we have a big impact globally on the what's happening in the environment and climate and so on.
Yeah. And Jason, one for you. Does Arup engage with NGOs on the path to a regenerative future? And can you give examples of individuals or institutions that you think are doing a good job in terms of making the transition to regenerative design?
I will say regenerative design is a really modern topic, and even in itself, it hasn't been well defined. Restorative has been really well defined. Regenerative is a fairly new term that's been floating around for the last couple of years. In terms of who's doing it well, I mean, I sort of already stated the Resilience Shift, which is a partnership, which I'd suggest go and checking that out. Check out the Stockholm Resilience Centre. That's really helpful as well. In terms of do we partner with NGOs? Yeah, absolutely. We have a whole division which is devoted to doing some parts of it is non-for-profit work, so doing pro bono work, but we also work closely with island nations, looking at, we do a lot of work in the Torres Strait and Vanuatu and island nations, Tonga, looking at geohazard assessments, education, and it's given that those are the areas really most susceptible to sea level rise, coming up with new types of solutions for sea level rise, looking at advancing coral growth and looking at how to prevent the disturbance of freshwater lenses. Like there's some really, because there's a lot of, they're obviously very susceptible to saltwater ingress into their groundwater as well, and often don't have the area to have a decent water supply. So it's a really tricky area, but we also do a lot of work with the Asian Development Bank in that sort of area as well. So they're probably a number.
Yeah, and there's quite a few questions coming through actually about collaborations, getting other people to do, combining work from different areas, incorporating data from hackathons, citizen science. And Beryl, you mentioned about schools contributing to TERN. Do citizen science, datathons, hackathons, water watch programs, do any of those come into, like what other collaborations could you just briefly mention? I'm sure you got heaps of them, but the question came through about that. So if you could just touch on that, that would be great.
They're all wonderful, and I mentioned how important social infrastructure is and networks and so on. So TERN is setting up some citizen science projects at the moment. There's another group similar to TERN called the Atlas of Living Australia that has already got a citizen science exercise up on, and you can go to their webpage. But TERN is using citizen scientists to add to people that are, to fill in the gaps in using our protocols, not just randomly adding data, because our data has to have continuity and be done in a particular way. We love hackathons. It's a really great way of getting the data that's collected put to use by posing problems and getting people to attack them. We love competitions. It's a new way of doing things, and in the US they offer very large prizes in competitions for people to come together, multiple institutions, researchers and so on, to take the data out of groups like TERN and the equivalents of TERN around the world and apply them to some of the grand challenge questions that are out there, which is why the prizes are big, because they're not trivial, they're really massive type things. So all of those are the way of the future. We'll provide the infrastructure, we'll provide the sort of the social networking glue, but we need everyone to be there with us on the journey.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? Like, go and talk to Department of Planning, Industry and Environment in New South Wales as well, because they have people that are dedicated to citizen science who want to talk to different groups who want to be doing this type of work, and they can sort of tell you how to sort of fit in on a state by state level as well. So like, there are resources there. Pick up the phone.
Yeah. And so we're running out of time. So Jason, if you were to describe what a sponge city was in 2 sentences.
Not about two sentences, but effectively a sponge city is and I've actually posted a link to this Cities Alive concept. So go and check that out. It's one of our articles, but sort of our thought pieces. But it was an initiative where there were 80 cities that essentially sort of opted into this. So a sponge city is a city that is able to resist so not to resist, but I suppose it's able to adapt to natural disasters and extreme responses in the environment. So the idea is that, when a flood say a flood comes through and the city being flooded, rather than just being a concrete structure, which when it fails, it fails epically, you actually, the ground itself is able to absorb that water and it's able to retain it. And so you actually get, rather than this, in a natural system, that base flow sort of increases, so the water table increases. So the idea is to actually build in more space and storage into the city so it can adapt, and also then support more biodiversity and natural ecosystems which can naturally resist, and that links in really strongly to regenerative, where wetlands then sort of serve as carbon sinks and sources of further biodiversity. So it's a way of sort of and it's still a bit sort of experimental, but there've been some great examples which we've highlighted in that white paper. So go take a look. Sorry, that wasn't 2 sentences, but whatever.
So Jason has shared some links to various things, including Sponge City. So make sure you check it out. One last question to each of you. What's the one issue that keeps you up at night that you want solved in 5-10 years time? What's the priority?
I think, yeah.
Sorry, Beryl, what did you say?
Yeah, I said data gap. We need to have greater collection points across Australia because every little ecosystem is different and it's hard to generalise, and our fauna and flora is so unique that we really do need to know more about it. So more monitoring, surveillance, sensors across Australia in a grid. Love to know how I could get that happening.
Yeah. Jason?
So for me, I think SDG 6.1, which is all related to clean water and sanitation, which is about equitable access to water. I think that's the #1 issue for me, and data really supports that. An extreme example of this is Jakarta, where the entire city is sinking because people believe they have a right to water and they have continually pumped from that system. So the entire city is sinking because of a depressurization, and the seawalls they've built are now sinking as well. So to me, that's a massive failure, and they're moving the entire capital somewhere else. Yep. So that's an extreme water example where equitable access to water, but it also water rights that are linked to that are sensible in the local context. That's and I guess we've got our own examples of the Murray-Darling Basin, which we have to deal with here locally as well.
Yeah, cool. That's amazing insights, and there's obviously a lot of things that we need to consider, research, understand, and I'm sure we'll all be following up on everything you've shared today. We will make this webinar available. We have recorded it, and Beryl, if anyone wants to get in touch or check out your website, where should they go?
TERN.org.au.
Yeah, and Jason?
Oh, yeah, sure. Email jason.carr@arup.com or go check out my LinkedIn.
Cool. So there you have it. So thank you so much for your insights, Jason and Beryl. We'll be sending out invites soon to the next Data for Good webinar. But in the meantime, everyone go outdoors, enjoy our beautiful environment. As Beryl and Jason have said, it's unique, it's amazing. Go out and enjoy it, and happy Environment Day, everyone.